All right, so the methods that we've covered so far in this section, such as the odd and even methods, are pretty simple. We've simply called them on our objects, in this case our fixed num objects or our integers, and we've gotten back a result. And those methods have been the exact same each time they've been called, simply writing the method name after the dot operator. Now, some methods can take what are called parameters, and parameters are basically just inputs that allow us to modify how that method performs. So what is a parameter? Well, methods on objects can accept one or more inputs. An input is just something that we give to the method that changes how it operates or how it performs its processes. The technical word that we use for an input in programming is an argument. The actual value that we supply to a method call is what's called the argument, or the arguments if there's more than one. Now, the parameter is the placeholder name assigned to each expected argument or each expected input. This is a kind of a difficult dichotomy to explain in words, so let's take a look at an example direct from the Ruby documentation. So let's bring up a sample piece of Ruby documentation. This is coming straight from the RubyDoc site. That's ruby-doc.org. And by this point in the course, you should start playing around with this website, just exploring a few of these pages, trying to get a sense if you can understand part of what's going on. Reading through documentation is a critical component of programming, and there's no way in this course that I can introduce you to every single feature, functionality, and method within Ruby. Many times you're simply going to have to go through the docs. So if you haven't checked it out by now, I do recommend Googling or going to rubydoc.org. So let's take a look at this sample method. It's called between, and we can see here it's a Boolean method. We can basically immediately tell that by the question mark at the very end of the method name. That basically tells us it's going to return a Boolean, a true or a false, as the result. So the between with the question mark is the method or the method name. And right after that, we see the min and max within parentheses. Now, this is what we actually call the parameters. The parameters are the names that we give to each of the expected inputs. So the between method is expecting two inputs. One of them is going to be min, one of them is going to be max. Now, obviously, hopefully, you can get a sense of what this method does. Basically, when it's called on a number, you give it a minimum and a maximum, or a lower bound and an upper bound. And if the number falls between those two numbers, then the method returns true, and if it does not fall between those two numbers, then it returns false. So on the right side of that arrow, we can see that the method returns a true or a false, so those are the possible return values. So that top bolded line basically tells us the method, the parameters, and the return value. Right below in the black box, we can see a couple examples of this method in action. And let's take a look at the first two there. We see that in the first one, the between method is called on the number 3, and we give the numbers 1 and 5 as the lower and upper bound. So whenever we call a method, whenever we actually use it in this case, the values that we pass in as the inputs are called the arguments, okay? So that's the difference between parameters and arguments. Parameters represent min and max here. Parameters are the names that we give to each of our expected inputs. The actual inputs themselves are called the arguments. So 1 and 5 here are the arguments in this first example. Min and max are the parameters to the between method. Similarly, in the second example, 1 and 5 are again the arguments, and then min and max represent the parameters or the names that we give those expected arguments or inputs, all right? So here we can see a sample method. You can start getting a sense of how it operates. We can see the first example says, is 3 between 1 and 5? It's a Boolean. It's going to return true because 3 does fall between those two numbers. And by the way this method works is inclusive. So both 1 and 5, the lower end and the upper end, are included. So if you do something like 5 and call between it and pass something like 1 to 5 as well, it's also going to return true. So that upper bound is included. We can also see another example right below, 6, and we call the between method on that integer. We pass in two arguments, 1 and 5. So 1 represents the min, 5 represents the max. 6 does not fall between those two numbers, so that method returns false. Let's take a look at this now in our Atom text editor. Okay, so here I am back within my Atom text editor. Now let's take a look at how the between method works in actual practice. This is our first introduction to a method that takes inputs or arguments, and as we know by now, parameters simply represent the names of those arguments. All right, so let's begin with a number like 20. It's a simple integer. We can call the between method. It does include a question mark at the end. If you do not include that question mark, you're going to get an error, so watch out. After that, we put in our arguments, and generally whenever we have a method that takes arguments, we do prefer to include parentheses to kind of hold them together. That's not actually required technically in Ruby, but it is considered best practice. So I'm going to open my parentheses here, and let's see if 20 is between 10 and 30. So we can see here our two arguments, or our two inputs here, are separated by a comma. That's how we separate multiple arguments. The best practice as well is after the comma you place a space. That just allows you to isolate each component. That's not required. Again, it just makes things simpler to see. When I execute this, we're going to get a true. It is true that 20 is between 10 and 30. It's kind of remarkable how this reads basically like regular English. Ruby is, as I mentioned, very renowned for its simplicity. If I instead do something like, is 20 between 30 and 50, it is not, so we're going to get a false for that result right here. This also works, by the way, on floating point numbers. So if I do p1.2, and then I once again call the between method, it's a little bit, perhaps a little bit jarring because we have two dots in a row, one to represent the float and one to actually represent the method call right here. But this is valid syntax. And if I check if 1.2 is between 1.1 and 1.3, for example, we are going to get a true right there. Similarly, if I do negative numbers, is negative 10.5 between negative 20 and 0? There is another true. And just to show you an example of in a case where it doesn't work, is 5.3 between 8.8 and 9.6. There we have a false. So in this lesson, we learned a little bit about the between method, which, as you can see, is another Boolean method that we can call. It returns a status of true or false. But the more important takeaway here is understanding the general structure of Ruby. Understanding that between is a method. It's called on an object, in this case, either a fixed num object or a float object. Understanding that what we're giving here within the parentheses represents what are called the arguments or the inputs. The between method obviously needs arguments. How is it supposed to know what number to, or what numbers to look between in order to calculate? If I said is 20 between and I didn't give you anything to compare it with, obviously you wouldn't be able to figure it out, and neither can a computer. Ruby needs to check, for example, whether 20 is between 10 and 30. We have to provide it arguments or our own custom inputs for it to know what to do. That's the point of arguments to a method. They allow the method many times to properly operate or to have more clarity on what it's supposed to do. So again, the actual things we give, the inputs, are arguments here. So 10 and 30 in the first example are our arguments to the between method. The name that we see, for example, in the documentation or when we get to writing methods of our own, the name we give to these inputs, in the documentation for this method, it was max and min. That's what we call the parameters. That is a slightly small difference. Parameters represents kind of the name when you're structuring the method. The arguments represents the arguments when you're actually invoking the argument. That's a small difference, but it does exist. When you're talking with other programmers, they're probably going to use the two terms interchangeably, parameter and argument, but there is a slight difference between those, so I did want to point that out. But that's the between method, and we'll explore some float methods in our next lesson, so I'll see you there.